Well, welcome to week number 3, and this is our introductory video for this week. We'll cover some of the topics that we'll be talking about this week and then some of the assignments that you will also be doing. So for this week, we are going to revisit some topics that we've talked about before. We have a few chapters that are assigned in the primary textbook. Chapter 6 looks at externalities in the environment. We've talked about externalities in previous videos. We've identified positive versus negative externalities. And we've said externalities are those unintended consequences that occur that will occur during the process, perhaps, of producing some good or some service. For negative externalities, we use the example of pollution. Positive externalities, we use the example of heightened productivity and higher levels of health from childhood immunization programs. So the reason why we talked about negative and positive externalities within the context of this course is because they help to explain to us how and why the public sector gets involved in the provision and or production of goods and services. We had identified that with a negative externality, government will get involved through regulation to try and either reduce the amount of that good that's being produced or to apply fees and charges to those who are producing that negative externality. We said the problem with the negative externality is that corporations don't take the cost of that negative externality into account in their supply and demand curve. They don't take it into account in terms of determining how much of a good or service to produce. So there's a role for government to get involved in order to reduce the production of the good that results in that negative externality. Because typically, goods that produce negative externalities from a societal perspective tend to be overproduced, whereas goods that result in a positive externality tend to be underproduced. And so you have a role for government to play with positive externalities in terms of things such as subsidies. And so they'll subsidize the production of the good or service in order to induce the corporation to produce more of that good or service to then have an increase in the positive externalities. The problem with positive externalities is you have free riders. And so you have individuals or groups who are benefiting from this good or service, but they're not paying for that good or service. When determining your amount of supply that you're going to create as a corporation, you will create a supply dependent upon demand. And in that demand calculation, you will have those individuals who are actually purchasing the good and paying for the good, but all the free riders who are not purchasing and paying for the good, but yet still deriving a benefit, will not be included in that decision-making calculus of how much of that good or service to provide or produce. So therefore, government gets involved to try and enhance the production of that good or service to then enhance the corresponding positive externalities. Chapter 7, you'll look at efficiency and equity. And this is something that the public sector has to consider. Whenever the public sector decides to get involved in provision and or production, the public sector needs to realize that in doing so, they have to balance a myriad of different values. In the private sector, the primary value of the private sector will obviously be efficiency and making a profit. Efficiency is important for public sector organizations as well, but as we all know as students of public administration, public sector organizations have other values that they have to emphasize beyond just efficiency. There's effectiveness, there's social equity, there's the protection of individual rights, there's political responsiveness, there's representative bureaucracy. Oftentimes, those additional values in the public sector will come into conflict with values such as efficiency that you traditionally see in the private sector. And then we have some very important trade-offs that we're going to have to make between values. Oftentimes, if you want to enhance equity and fairness, that's going to come at the cost of a reduction in efficiency. If you want to enhance efficiency, then you may have a reduction in your ability to achieve social equity. So a lot of our values come into conflict with each other. And so when we decide if the public sector should be involved in provision and production and to what extent the public sector should involve itself, we have to consider a whole myriad of values that oftentimes are mutually exclusive with each other. And that's some information that you will cover as you read that chapter of the textbook as well. We will expand upon our discussion we've had so far about public production of goods and services. Remember, we made this distinction in a previous video between provision and production. Provision is giving the resources that will then make the production process possible. Production is the actual creation of that good or that service. And then you'll also be introduced to this idea about public choice theory. Public choice theory argues that essentially governments offer a bundle of goods and services to their citizens. And if you can go back in the 1950s, and a very famous theorist by the name of Charles Tiebout, Tiebout. And Charles Tiebout made this argument, what he called the mobile consumer thesis, arguing that governments provide unique bundles of goods and services to their citizens. So in City A, it will have its own unique bundle of goods and services, and that bundle of goods and services may emphasize recreation and leisure. So there might be a nice recreation center and a lot of different types of recreation programs funded in City A's budget. City B, by contrast, may place more of a value on services for senior citizens. And so that's where a lot of their expenditures are going to go. If you're living in City A, according to mobile consumer thesis, and you don't like the emphasis on a recreation center and you would prefer an emphasis on a senior center, then you can vote with your feet. And you can move from City A to City B to seek out that bundle of goods and services that will be more in line with your wants, needs, and desires. That's Tiebout's mobile consumer thesis, that people vote with their feet. That's really the underpinnings of this idea of public choice theory, that governments provide these bundles of goods and services, and then citizens have a choice, and they can choose what city they want to live in that corresponds with the bundle of goods and services that they desire. Now, we all know that it's not that easy. We know that there are limitations and obstacles to individuals' ability to move from one city to another. And a countervailing theory that comes from Paul Peterson argues that there are certain limitations, such as people have job ties, and so it may, if they move to City B, it may be too far for them to commute to work. They have family ties. If all their family lives in City A, they're probably not going to want to move to City B. But most importantly, Peterson points out that in order to vote with your feet, you need to have the financial wherewithal to be able to do so. And some folks just don't have the resources they need to pick up their lives and move to another city. What you ended up getting, especially in the 1970s and the 1980s in a lot of Rust Belt cities, is you ended up with people voting with their feet, that people who lived in these large cities were unhappy with the bundle of goods and services they were getting. So they were unhappy with crime. They were unhappy with the quality of the public schools. So they then moved to the secondary and tertiary suburbs outside of the major metropolitan areas. But the people who did that were the ones who had the financial wherewithal to do so. So people from upper socioeconomic status levels, those were the ones who moved out of the major cities and moved to the secondary and tertiary suburbs, because they were, again, pursuing that bundle of goods and services that better met their wants, needs, and desires. The problem with that, obviously, for major metropolitan areas is that you are losing the folks who are paying most of the taxes. You're losing people from your upper income levels, and you're losing a lot of your tax revenue. So you're losing a lot of your capacity to provide goods and services to your citizens. So it came to be known as the donut effect. And so you saw this hollowing out of cities as all these upper income and middle income individuals moved out to the suburbs. What compounds that donut effect is not only are you having a drain placed upon your tax capacity because you are losing all these affluent residents and therefore tax revenue, but those residents who remain, who are from lower socioeconomic status levels, those are the individuals who are demanding more from government. So those large metropolitan governments had a reduction in their capacity to generate revenue, but an increase on their service demands. And so it's kind of the worst of both worlds. They were being asked to do more and provide more services, but then had less revenue to do it. And that whole idea of people voting with their feet and following the bundle of goods and services they desire, that's this idea behind what's known as public choice theory. People vote with their feet and they can then compare what they get from one government versus another government and then make those informed types of choices. Public choice theory is all predicated on this idea of people as rational, self-interested actors. And while they are rational, self-interested actors, we have to remember that there are limitations to just how much someone can pursue their own rational self-interest. We'll talk about public choice theory, and we'll discuss how public choice theory affects how much intervention we have, government intervention we have in the provision and production of goods and services. So those are the types of concepts that we're going to be dealing with this week. In your discussion board, you have a discussion board in which you will be identifying 3 concepts from 3 different chapters of your textbook. You'll identify those 3 concepts, identify 3 concepts from 3 different videos as well. Once you do that, you'll be posting in your discussion board a description of each concept. So 3 concepts from the chapters in the book, 3 concepts from 3 different videos that have been provided to you in your learning resources. Describe each concept. Do you think the average American has a good understanding of the concept? Why or why not? If they don't, what misconceptions might they have about that concept? And then provide an example that illustrates the concept with a real life situation. This should be an example that you create rather than just restating something in the book or a video. And this is a chance for you to demonstrate you're able to move theory to practice. And as always in an MPA program, this is what we are looking to do. MPA programs are both professional programs as well as academic programs. So we're always looking for that nexus between theory and practice. And the purpose of this discussion board is to allow you to find that nexus between theory and practice for some of the important concepts that are presented to you from both the textbook as well as some of your supplemental videos. Those concepts, the choice of those concepts, completely up to you. If you want to talk about public goods, you can do that. If you want to talk about inflation, you can do that. Recession, whatever concepts really appeal to you, you can then select those and use them as the topic for your discussion board. As always, remember that as you illustrate these concepts, remember that you are also then responding to classmates as well. Don't forget to respond to at least 2 of your classmates. Then your writing assignment, then you'll select 3 concepts from the book or video, select 3 journal articles, 1 on each topic, and then create an annotated bibliography style paper. And I'm assuming you've probably done an annotated bibliography before in the MPA program. Annotated bibliographies are very common types of assignments that you have in graduate programs. They afford you the opportunity to gain exposure to peer-reviewed journal articles, to read and analyze those articles, and then to be able to distill the important aspects of each article into a paragraph annotation. So as you do these annotations, what you want to include in your annotation, what was the topic of the research, which concept from the book or videos did it address, what was the main conclusion of the articles, how did the article expand or change your ideas? And so the way in which your annotated bibliography will look is that you will have a citation for the article that you are using, followed then by a paragraph that will be your annotation. And then for the next article, a citation in APA format, and then a paragraph and annotation for that second article, and so on and so on. And that's the way in which you want your annotated bibliography to look. So an annotated bibliography is different than a true literature review in that the annotated bibliography is kind of a quicker look at these articles whereby you're not putting into a long narrative type of paper like you would do with a literature review, citation, then annotation, citation, and then annotation. So that's your annotated bibliography assignment. There's an example here on the screen, and you can use that as a guide for how your annotation should look. But do remember that your annotations, your citations should be in APA format. Make sure you adhere to APA format, as you can see there on the screen. And then after each citation, you'll have a 1-paragraph annotation synopsis of that article. Double spaces always, and again, it's very important that you use APA format. As you know, we use APA 7th edition, and so it's just a real quick reminder on APA 7th edition. It's a little wacky, for lack of a better term, in that your journal titles will appear in italics. So remember to italicize your journal titles. And then for your article titles, every word of the article title does not need to be capitalized. So for your article title, it will not be in italics, but you will capitalize the first word, and that's the only word you'll capitalize in that article title, unless you have a semicolon, and then you'll capitalize the first word after that colon. But for the most part, it's only the first word of the article title that gets capitalized, and then your journal titles are then provided in italics. That's kind of a real quick synopsis of APA 7th edition. It feels weird if you haven't used APA before. It kind of feels a little strange the first time you do it, but you will get used to it. And you should, if you're early on in the program, you need to get used to it now because it's APA format that you'll be using throughout the entire program. As you're finding your articles for your annotated bibliography, as always, use the databases with the university library. Google Scholar is another good source that you can use to find peer-reviewed journal articles. But again, we're looking for peer-reviewed journal articles. And as you know from your previous courses in the program, it's important to use peer-reviewed journal articles for the purpose of credibility. We want to make sure that these articles have been vetted by others so that they're as accurate as they can possibly be. Typically, academic journals will use a blind refereed review process whereby all manuscripts will go to an editor. The editor will then send that manuscript on an anonymous basis to a panel of reviewers, typically anywhere from 3 to 5 reviewers who are experts on that topic. Those reviewers will then review the manuscript. They will provide feedback back to the editor in terms of things that should be changed or whether or not the article is of adequate quality to be in the journal. If there is another journal that would be more suitable for the article, they might recommend that as well. And typically what editors will ask their reviewers is to recommend either publication, revision and resubmission, what's called a revise and resubmit, or an R&R, or denial, rejection. The vast majority of manuscripts fall into that second category of revise and resubmit. So an article, a manuscript that gets a revise and resubmit type of decision, the editor will take all those suggested revisions from all the reviewers, and will then provide that feedback to the author and invite the author to make those changes and then resubmit the article once those changes have been made. Now, it doesn't mean that once you make those changes and you resubmit the article, that's going to go directly to publication. It doesn't. It goes back to review again, and will usually go back to those reviewers so that they can review and make sure that those revisions have been made. You may go through multiple iterations in a revise and resubmit, where it may take 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times before the article is then deemed worthy of publication. But the vast majority of manuscripts go through that revise and resubmit process. It's much less likely that it will be an acceptance, an out-and-out acceptance. That happens very rarely. That's only happened to me twice in 26 years. So it's very unusual just to have the article, the manuscript, accepted as is. Usually it's revised and resubmit. But again, that type of blind refereed process allows us to be confident in the methodologies used by the authors and the conclusions that the authors arrive at as well. So do make sure for this annotated bibliography that you are using peer-reviewed journal articles. And I'm sure you've been using peer-reviewed journal articles before, and so you're familiar with some of the major peer-reviewed journals in the field of public administration. Clearly, the top flight journal is Public Administration Review, PAR, and I'm sure you've used a lot of articles from PAR before. That's the kind of gold standard in public administration. American Review of Public Administration is another strong peer-reviewed journal. In terms of specific subfields within public administration, public budgeting and finance for financial issues is another very good journal. Public personnel management, if you're in the realm of human resource management, that's another good peer-reviewed journal. State and local government is state and local government review is another good peer-reviewed journal. The one that I work with a lot is called Publius. It's the Publius, the Journal of Federalism, for issues that deal with intergovernmental relations. But those are just some of the gold standard types of journals. There are a lot of other journals in public administration as well. You don't have to select articles just from those gold standard journals that I've discussed before. You can select from any peer-reviewed journal. So do make sure that your articles are coming directly from those peer-reviewed journals. So that's the idea for this week. Again, this screen just kind of gives you an idea of how you can use Google Scholar in order to find some of those peer-reviewed journal articles. As always, if you have questions as we move throughout the week, feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. But some of the major takeaways from this week will be kind of a review of some of the things we've addressed in earlier videos. Want to make sure that you understand externalities, both positive as well as negative externalities. Obviously, market failures that we've discussed several times already in this class, and then understand how those externalities and market failures contribute to government involvement in the provision and or production of goods and services. And then understand some of the implications of government involvement in provision and or production, because the public sector does have these additional values that need to be considered, as opposed to if the provision and production was left solely to the private sector. And so we have a lot of additional difficult decisions we have to make in balancing efficiency with all those other values that underpin the study in the field of public administration. But again, any questions, please do ask. Otherwise, I wish everyone a very good week. I look forward to reading your work.